Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to dive into the surprisingly complex world of medieval sleep, or more accurately, how people slept before the invention of mattresses that remember your spine's every curve. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. Before electricity, TikTok, and the cult of sleep hygiene, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would absolutely baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. They practiced what was known as segmented sleep, a natural two-part cycle, split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was simple, yet utterly foreign to us. After sundown, most folks turned in early, drifting off into what was called first sleep. This would last for about 4 hours. Then, after this initial slumber, they would deliberately wake up and spend the next hour or two doing, well, what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia or some medical anomaly. It was just how sleep worked. It was the standard operating procedure for bodies unburdened by artificial light and the relentless demands of a 24/7 economy. The period between the two sleeps, often referred to as the watch, was seen as practical, useful, and occasionally alarmingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts by flickering candlelight, tend fires, because, let's be honest, nothing ruins your REM cycle like wondering if your house is about to burn down or check their livestock. Imagine stumbling out into the frosty night to ensure your prize pig hasn't wandered off, all while half asleep. This wasn't just pragmatic, it was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals, in what sounds like a politely clinical assessment, noted that the body was well rested and calm of mind during this period, which, let's be real, is probably a very eloquent way of saying too tired to argue. So, if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. After this interlude of prayer, productivity, or passion, the second sleep would follow, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from monks to farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures, like the ever-observant Chaucer, casually mentioned it in their writings, which means that yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about not sleeping properly. It's a timeless human experience, apparently. Oddly enough, modern science has actually suggested that segmented sleep might be more natural for humans. Our circadian rhythms, in the absence of artificial light, seem to align quite well with a 2-sleep cycle. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Don't reach for your phone to scroll through endless cat videos. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend to a symbolic fireplace, perhaps. Historians still debate whether segmented sleep was a universal practice across all social classes, or if it varied significantly by region and occupation. Some argue that the richer nobility, with their access to more consistent light sources and servants to tend to their needs, might have gravitated towards a single, longer sleep, though direct evidence is sparse. The odd detail here is how this natural, accepted rhythm completely disappeared. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its relentless factory schedules, the advent of gas lamps, and a growing, almost neurotic, fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. It was as though sleep itself had become a timed sport, a competitive endeavor where the goal was to achieve a single, unbroken stretch of unconsciousness. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a failure. It was just the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. We spend fortunes chasing that perfect, uninterrupted slumber. But in medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. It was less about comfort and more about basic survival. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack, that is. If not, it was just straw directly on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat who viewed it as a 5-star resort. These pallets were not what you'd call comfortable, but they were infinitely better than nothing, which was often the alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly good at insulating against the cold. It was also, unfortunately, excellent at harboring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse. This made sleeping an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. It was a constant, low-level war with your bedding, a nightly skirmish against the creeping crawlies. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back, that couldn't handle sleeping directly on the floor, they might elevate their straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't exactly change the sleep experience dramatically, but it did slightly reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear. Slightly. Linens were a rare treat, a luxury enjoyed by very few. Most people simply slept in the clothes they wore, all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and neither, frankly, was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent or two, all slept together in the same space, sometimes even on the same straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always just roll into your cousin's elbow. It was like a permanent, slightly too close slumber party, but without the snacks or the late-night gossip. Nobles, of course, had proper beds, large wooden frames, feather mattresses, actual feathers, mind you, not just the illusion of them embroidered sheets and canopies to keep out the drafts, and one hoped, the lice. These beds were so valuable, so central to a family's status, that they were often passed down in wills. You didn't just inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Historians still debate the exact composition of these wealthier beds, given the perishable nature of the materials. Were they truly soft, or just less hard than straw? We may never know for sure. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort or indulgent relaxation. It was a utilitarian object, a place to avoid freezing to death, to keep the chickens out of your hair, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle when you moved. It put a new spin on the phrase, sleeping like a baby, because babies, at least, don't usually wake up with straw in their hair. The odd detail here is the dual purpose of these communal sleeping arrangements: warmth and sometimes security. A shared bed meant shared body heat, which was crucial in drafty, unheated homes. It also meant there were more eyes, or ears, to detect intruders, human or otherwise. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cozy little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a warm fire, and perhaps a questionable decision or two. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat. A real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the biting cold. And central heating? That was called a dog. So, to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. Imagine trying to get ready for your big day out when your hair has decided to become a permanent resident. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had a surprising amount of social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep. And the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status. Because nothing says I've arrived quite like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." Or, more bluntly, "And yes, this hat does mean go away." It's like the medieval equivalent of putting a "do not disturb" sign on your forehead. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. The odd detail here is how this seemingly simple garment could convey such complex social signals. It wasn't just about warmth. It was about status, modesty, and even signaling your availability for interaction. Historians still debate the specific regional variations in nightcap styles and their precise social implications across different parts of medieval Europe. The material, the color, the length of the point, all could have subtle meanings lost to time, like trying to decipher the fashion trends from 1,000 years ago. It's a stark contrast to our modern sleepwear, which is often chosen for comfort, style, or simply because it's the oldest, most stained t-shirt you own. Medieval people, however, understood that in a world without central heating, every little bit of insulation counted, even if that little bit made you look like a pointy-headed gnome. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up where you realize your private room is actually just a futon in someone's living room. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal, and often not at all optional. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a private room, or a dedicated bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. It was an unheard of concept. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or, more alarmingly, have a suspicious number of boils. This wasn't considered rude. It was just efficient use of resources. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travelers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged, elbow territory was fiercely contested, and the symphony of human bodily noises was the night's soundtrack. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns even tried to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and, allegedly, thieves with other thieves. But often, it was first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was a significant upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. It was pragmatic. A bed was a bed, and warmth was warmth, regardless of who provided the latter. Worried about theft, many travelers slept with their purse tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning their meager luggage into both a pillow and an alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort, or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. This stark contrast highlights the vast social divide, even in something as basic as sleep. Historians still debate the extent of social mixing in these shared beds. While common for travelers, the frequency of locals sharing beds with strangers in their own homes is less clear. The odd detail here is the sheer casualness with which personal boundaries were breached. Imagine checking into a hotel today and being told you're sharing a king-size bed with 3 random people. We'd call the police. They called it Tuesday. It underscores a fundamental difference in cultural values, where privacy was a luxury only for the very wealthy, and communal living was simply a fact of life. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a communal experience, a gamble, and a testament to basic human resilience. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was often a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence, the immense popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul, cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, demons, or, most dangerously, simply being over 30-inch the year 1247. So, you'd better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, though that might have been a side benefit, but because hell was terrifying, and you absolutely did not want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common version of a children's prayer, which sounds sweet until you actually think about it, was, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. It's a pretty grim way to tuck yourself in. Many adults had a whole catalog of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, and one for plague prevention, which, unfortunately, aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The really devout monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which probably wasn't hard, because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls, and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. Historians still debate the extent to which these prayers were genuinely heartfelt spiritual acts versus rote traditions driven by fear. Was it true devotion, or just hedging your bets against eternal damnation? Probably a bit of both. The odd detail is the specificity of some of these prayers. There wasn't just a generic goodnight prayer. There were prayers tailored for specific anxieties, like the fear of sudden death or demonic temptation during sleep. It highlights a culture where the spiritual world was woven intimately into every waking and sleeping moment. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random, nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very, very seriously, as in eternal consequences, serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations, and either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down, or confess it, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire might be hell, dreamt of water could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, you'd better call a priest immediately and possibly move. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams truly mattered because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just hunger. But still, better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. Historians still debate the precise methods of dream interpretation and whether there was a standardized dictionary of dream symbols, or if it was more ad hoc and individualized. The odd detail is the sheer terror some people felt about their dreams. It wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a potential window into damnation. Imagine waking up in a cold sweat, not because you had a nightmare about forgetting your pants, but because you think a demon just told you to burn down the local church. It truly put a new spin on morning anxieties. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was often a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names, and central heating that was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes even the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up at your feet. Pigs snorted softly beside the hearth. And if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't primarily about affection, though medieval people certainly appreciated their animals. It was about survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, they didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing, and a cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat, and a chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock. As for hygiene, let's not ask too many questions. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed, not for heat, but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favorite animals, because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals can be loud, they can wander, and they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the bedtime routine. Historians still debate the specific types of animals most commonly found sharing human sleeping quarters, though pigs, dogs, and chickens appear frequently in historical accounts. The odd detail is the practical acceptance of what we would consider utterly unhygienic and chaotic. It speaks to a very different relationship between humans and their immediate environment, where comfort was a distant second to basic warmth and survival. Remember how we talked about communal sleeping for humans? Well, extend that to the entire barnyard, and you've got the picture. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, really. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were often just wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling particularly generous or it was a feast day. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, including robe, belt, and sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up. If you got hot, well, no, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested, under the rule of Saint Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimal, 1 candle maybe. You didn't need to see, you just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, a preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess. Sleep was not a pleasure, it was a necessity, monitored and scheduled like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxury or dreams or circulation. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Historians still debate the exact reasons for such extreme asceticism in monastic sleeping arrangements. Was it purely spiritual discipline, or also a practical way to fit more monks into limited space? It was likely a combination. The odd detail here is the focus on discomfort as a virtue. The harder the bed, the colder the room, the more fragmented the sleep, the more pious you were considered. It's like a spiritual competition to see who could get the worst night's rest. Remember our discussion about segmented sleep? For monks, the watch period was almost entirely dedicated to rigorous prayer. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m., and not for a bathroom break or a doom scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by someone who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle off to the chapel in silence. And yes, still in full clothing, because monks didn't do pajamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by flickering candlelight and under the echo of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their best not to fall asleep on their feet, which, incidentally, was a real issue. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations. You now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down after the service. Monks would either return to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice, comfort, and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion, or at least it was once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. Historians still debate the psychological impact of such a demanding sleep schedule on the monks, and whether it fostered genuine spiritual growth or simply chronic exhaustion. The odd detail here is the institutionalization of discomfort as a pathway to piety. It wasn't about finding a balance. It was about pushing physical limits in pursuit of spiritual purity. Remember those communal, plank-like beds? This early morning ritual was the grand finale to a night designed for anything but restful slumber. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just an ability to control the blanket without a nightly wrestling match. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. Beds, as we've established, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. So people shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul might be vulnerable to temptation. Or, worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it, or catch the demon first. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all part of the nightly landscape. Tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales didn't end in hugs, they ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed would have been considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious contexts, even monks often slept communally, strusace, and if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. Medieval logic, solitary sleep grants opportunity for sin. Group sleep, public accountability. Historians still debate the specific social implications of this pervasive communal sleeping and how it shaped concepts of personal space and intimacy over time. The odd detail here is how pervasive this practice was, cutting across social classes, at least to some extent, driven by a combination of practical need and deep-seated superstition. Next time, you're curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. Because in medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons. none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubled as the community's health consultant, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy boy. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about health. It was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about quality rest. It was about virtue, discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. Historians still debate the true prevalence of upright sleeping across different social classes and whether it was primarily a choice or a necessity in some contexts. The odd detail here is the dual rationale behind it, both pseudo-medical and deeply spiritual. It highlights how intertwined practical health concerns and religious beliefs were in the medieval mind. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily, but nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants, tasked with removing lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was pest defense armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may have done little for the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says, "I love you" like, "Let us be united like the flea that bites us both." Historians still debate the true impact of these pervasive infestations on public health and daily life, beyond the obvious discomfort. Did they contribute to the spread of diseases, or were people largely resilient to their presence? The odd detail here is the cultural acceptance and even poetic acknowledgement of these pests. They weren't just a nuisance. They were a part of life, a constant, itchy reminder of the natural world's close proximity. So, while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer choice. Comfort, optional, survival, highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men at arms might even sleep with swords or axes at their side, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a bad habit of pinching skin. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not in battle sometimes wore light, protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons' thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. And lest we forget, armor wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived again. Historians still debate the frequency of armored sleep, and whether it was truly a common practice or more of a desperate measure in extreme circumstances. The odd detail here is the sheer practicality overriding any concept of comfort. The body adjusts to incredible discomfort when survival is on the line. Remember when we discussed the lack of comfort in medieval beds in general? Well, add a few layers of metal to that equation, and you get the picture. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest that people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost, or heretic, or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad humors, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. In one curious twist, there were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign, or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover all spiritual bases. Historians still debate the true prevalence of sleepwalking incidents during the medieval period, and how much of the fear was rooted in genuine occurrences versus superstitious anxieties. The odd detail here is how readily something as mundane as sleepwalking could be interpreted as a sign of supernatural influence or moral failing. It highlights a mindset where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were far more fluid than today. Remember our earlier discussion about dreams being messages from higher powers? Sleepwalking was just another, more active form of that nightly spiritual engagement. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day. Sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia. Neither did plowing, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep somehow through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled by in the morning, it was considered more of a grim wake-up call than a cause for panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted. If you worked from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard. And then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape hatch, faced with illness, grief, or the fear of the world literally ending, which was forecast roughly every century. Some people just curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. Historians still debate the psychological coping mechanisms at play here, and whether this ability to sleep through turmoil was a conscious choice or an involuntary adaptation to constant stress. The odd detail here is the almost Zen-like acceptance of extreme external disruptions. It wasn't about finding quiet, it was about finding peace within the noise. Remember how we talked about communal sleeping and sharing beds with animals? All that contributed to a baseline level of ambient noise, making external events just part of the symphony of existence. Okay, we've journeyed through the strange, often uncomfortable, and undeniably resilient world of medieval sleep. It's a world that feels so far removed from our own temperature-controlled, memory foam realities. A world where a good night's rest might have meant not getting eaten by a rat or just managing to avoid a demonic visitation. We've seen how sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, but a deeply social, spiritual, and even military act. As the sun sets on our historical journey tonight, take a moment to appreciate your own bed, your own quiet room, and the sweet, sweet luxury of uninterrupted sleep. You might not have the excitement of a midnight prayer service or the warmth of a pig snuggled at your feet, but you also don't have to worry about lice as roommates or waking up to the clank of armor. The medieval world had a raw, unfiltered connection to existence, where every moment, even the unconscious ones, was a testament to survival. So, as you drift off tonight, let the echoes of distant church bells and the phantom rustle of straw fade away. Let the thought of shared beds and vigilant prayers give way to your own private, peaceful slumber. The past was a wild, noisy, sometimes itchy place, and they managed to sleep through it all. Perhaps there's a lesson in that resilience for us in our own chaotic modern times. Now, close your eyes. The journey is over for tonight.